Hey, Sterling Cousins. You already know what time it is. Animated horror stories. Animated horror stories. Doom, doom, doom. Boom, boom, boom. Ding, zing, zing, zing. You see where we at? We are at our cousin SSG Animation's house. You can see, you ain't blind. You know? As always, go over there and subscribe. And then we are doing three True Curse games, horror stories animated. We did Urban Legends last time and it was fire. Not gonna lie, it was crazy. So we're gonna do these curse games and we're gonna see what's going on. Please go and subscribe to them and please like this video. Okay? Let's get into it. Go on, grab a blunt, grab a bottle of water, grab a bag of chips, and grab a blanket, please, so you can be snug. All right? All right. And let's get up in here. What? 18 seconds in, right?
My name is Jeremy Cole, and for about 5 years, I worked as an accounting manager for one of the largest business firms in the country. My life for those 5 years was seemingly perfect. But little did I know that what would come after in the next few years would be far from that. In the year 2018, the firm I worked for decided to let employees go in an attempt to cut costs on salaries. Sadly, I was one of the employees let go. My life only went downhill from that point. Attempts at getting a new job seemed pointless at the time, but the pandemic that came in 2020 made an idea of getting a new job impossible. And in just 3 years, my wife had divorced me and taken the kids, leaving me with regular child support payments while unemployed. And suddenly, by 2021, I found myself in nearly crippling debt.
Damn.
I owed banks and family members huge sums of money, while at the same time being behind on almost all my bills. It was this situation that led me to make one single life-changing decision. A decision that could have gone horribly wrong. The date was November 13th, 2021. And as I said earlier, I was behind on a lot of payments, and so I decided I needed to find another way to make money and fast. I looked on the web for fast ways to earn large sums of money, and was bombarded immediately with numerous sites advertising freelance jobs and how much I could earn from them. I ignored these sites as I had previously attempted freelancing during the quarantine. Now, looking for something a lot more serious and promising. After scrolling for some time, I eventually found a site that wasn't necessarily what I was looking for, but intrigued me, as it gave detailed examples and instructions on ancient rituals used to make money and fast. Now, at the time, I wasn't the type to believe in rituals, spirits, or religion. But as the saying goes, desperate times call for desperate measures. So I looked through the site till I found one relatively easy that seemed to be the answer to my problems. It was called The Man in the Fields. I began to read what the site had to say on the game. It is advised not to play this game, but to those who seek wealth and protection, engage at your own risk. If you indeed win this game, you will be granted financial and physical protection for an entire year. But if you lose, the consequences could be dire. To begin this game, you must summon the Man in the Fields. To do this, you will need to go into your backyard with a lantern and ask 7 times, but who will scare the crows away? If you hear nothing after the 7th time, then the summoning failed and the game is over. But if you hear a voice say, "That's not your biggest problem," then the game has now begun. At this point, the first thing you'll need to do is to go into your home and find a room with only one door. Put a crucifix in it and close everything in it that can be closed. This will be your safe haven. Once you leave this room, you will find that everything in your home that can be open will be open, and your job is to close all these items before the clock strikes 12. Throughout the ritual, as you close each item that is opened, you will see an eerie man dressed in farmer's overalls with a deathly complexion on his face. Ignore him, as he is not the man, but the herald, and not what you should fear. At no point should you look into your yard. If you do, you will see the elongated man in the fields, and he will see you. However, if this should happen, you will need to return to your safe haven immediately and remain there as the man in the fields will rush his way into your home in search of you. Close your eyes till the sun comes up, and this will end the game. Otherwise, you will be caught by the man in the fields, and pagan deities are unforgiving. But if you complete the task at hand without looking at the man, return to your room, and once the sun comes up, the man in the fields will reward you. I spent the next few days thinking over whether or not the game was a good idea. Despite my lack of belief in the supernatural, I wasn't too eager to summon a pagan deity after being warned not to. But then, one afternoon, I received a call from my ex-wife. Hello? I knew I hadn't paid child support for the past 2 months, but was surprised as she usually wasn't the one who called. Jeremy, I'm just calling you to give you a heads up. My lawyers and I filed a complaint against you, and we have a court date in January. You're going to receive the papers soon, but I simply felt I should be the one to tell you myself. Goodbye. She hung up immediately after that, and I slowly felt myself being filled with confusion and disappointment. Soon enough, I felt nothing but anger, and without any further hesitation, I knew what to do. I decided to play the game at my parents' house, as they barely stayed there on weekends and were the only people I knew personally who had a backyard. It started getting dark around 6 p.m., and I began looking for the room I would use as my safe haven. My childhood bedroom turned out to be the best option, as it was basically empty and barely had anything in it that would need to be closed. So I took my mom's crucifix and placed it in the center of the room before heading out to start the game. The time was 11 p.m., and it was now completely dark out. The thought of what I was about to do made the yard look scarier than it ever had, and despite having made up my mind on what I had to do, I could feel a lump form in my throat as I lit the candle and stepped into the yard.
As it should be.
With every step I took deeper into the yard, I said the words, "But who will scare the crows away?" After the 6th time, I stood with my hands shaking slightly as I wondered if I should stop and walk back in. But I simply took a deep breath and said for the 7th time, "But who will scare the crows away?" The silence in the yard was almost deafening. I could feel my heart beating, and after a while, not hearing anything, I blew the candle out and began walking towards the house, partly relieved. It was only then that I heard a voice that sent shivers down my spine say, "That's not your biggest problem." My instinctive reaction was to turn to see who spoke, but luckily, I quickly remembered the rules of the game and kept walking to the house. It was impossible to not notice what had obviously changed about the house. All doors, drawers, shelves, and cans were open, and I immediately began to close them. With every door I closed, I made sure to not even mistakenly look outside. The kitchen took the longest as numerous cans, bottles, and pots were opened, but I carefully closed them all, one after the other. It was only as I closed the kettle I noticed the reflection of a man with a hat standing behind me. I began to shake as I put the lid back on the kettle, unsure of whether to turn to look at him.
No, because it said that's fine.
I decided to simply glance as I left the kitchen. The figure stood in the kitchen, was dressed in farmer's clothes, and every part of him was gray and stained with what I assumed was dirt. He had no footsteps as he followed me slowly around the house while I continued the task. I remembered the site said to ignore the being, but that wasn't easy in the slightest, as I was completely scared and couldn't tell where the figure was most of the time. But eventually, I was done. I shut the last door and expected the figure following me to disappear, but it didn't. And soon enough, I began panicking as I wondered if I had carried out the wrong task. The being stood still, and I decided to go rouse the house once more to ensure I had closed everything. But something was different this time, as the being was no longer just silently following me and seemed closer every time I looked. My heart began pounding, and I couldn't stop shaking. Suddenly, I noticed an empty open can in the kitchen sitting beside the sink, and I hoped closing it would send the being away. I walked towards the sink, but as I picked up the can, it slipped and fell right out of my hands. At this point, I could feel the figure standing directly behind me, looking over my shoulder.
You never even did this shit.
I was fully focused on the being now, so I slowly picked up the can, but as I got back up, I was met by the window that sat over the sink and a clear view of the backyard. My heart stopped, and the figure disappeared as I stared at what I could only describe as a bunch of bones and sticks put together to look like a scarecrow. The scarecrow was about 8 feet tall, with arms reaching the ground, and in place of its usual pumpkin head was an inhuman skull. I stood frozen as I stared out the window. The man in the fields began to slowly come closer, and before I knew, he was running towards the house.
And is.
I immediately dropped the can and began racing to my room upstairs.
Damn.
I could hear heavy footsteps behind me, but continued running. And right before closing the door, I got a good look at the creature I had summoned.
Close your eyes.
I shut the door, and the house was filled with a piercing
close your
screech, followed by claw sounds and bangs on the door. The clawing and screeching continued, and I simply cried, gripping the crucifix and praying for the sun to come up.
Close your eyes.
This went on for hours, but eventually, all I heard was silence. I stayed in my childhood bedroom till 3 p.m. that day. The sun had been up for a while, but my fear didn't let me leave as the image of the man in the fields played over in my memory. In the months that followed, I had my parents admit me into a mental clinic as I kept seeing shadowy figures everywhere and was constantly waking up from nightmares. My court date came and passed, and my absence resulted in my wife claiming the apartment I was living in and most of what little I had left, but I didn't care much. It's been 2 years now, and no amount of time has been able to help me forget that night. I never see my family anymore, and I barely get by with the job I have as a janitor. Things seem to be getting worse, but no matter how bad they get, I would warn everyone, never summon a man in the fields.
We won't. We're not you. We're not dumb.
When I was a teenager, I had a friend who lived near the forest. Our small town in Colorado had a mountain on one side and a thick forest on the other. Henry and I grew up together. His house was big and built sometime during the 1800s. A full wooden house with a wine cellar and a basement. Once, while playing in his backyard, he stumbled over something and fell. It wasn't a rock, because we always made sure that there were no rocks in the backyard while we played.
Cole, see? It looks like a metal box.
There in the middle of the backyard was a
dig it
corner
up.
of a metal box peeking from the ground.
Yeah,
Where'd it
let's
go?
dig it and see if we find some treasure.
We
Oh,
both were very
great.
excited to find something as we knew that Henry's house had a history even before his family bought it. We sat on the ground and started digging with our hands, getting the dirt between our nails and on our clothes. We did not care. All we wanted was to find what was inside the box. Finally, after a few hours of digging and completely getting ourselves dirty, we removed the box from the ground. It was an old tin case. Henry, being the more curious of us, shook the box violently against his ear. We could hear something in the box like a piece of glass or something. Unfortunately, we couldn't open the box as it had an old rustic-looking lock on it. We should ask your dad to break the lock for us so we can find what's in there, I suggested, and we both ran inside with the box in hand.
Leave that shit alone.
We found Henry's dad sitting in the drawing room watching TV. Why are you boys so dirty? And what is that?
We found this box in the backyard while playing, and we want you to break the lock so we can see if there's treasure inside.
Henry told his father. His dad laughed and took the box from us. He grabbed a small screwdriver and a hammer and broke the lock, and then handed us the box. We went to the backyard and opened
You
the
gonna
box.
open it for him?
But before we could take a
Oh,
look
Lord,
at what
open
was
it.
inside, Henry said,
Whatever we find, we split it 50-50. Agreed?
"Absolutely." I complied eagerly. Then we opened the box. We were hoping to find a treasure or at least some money or something extremely valuable. But instead, there was a thick piece of paper folded in half and a tear-shaped piece of glass.
Looks like it's a map to
diamond.
hidden treasure.
Henry said, too eager to find some long-lost treasure. "Let's open it and see what it is," I said. We opened the folded paper, and to our surprise, it was a very old-looking Ouija board.
No.
Wow, a Ouija board. What the hell? It's pretty cool.
Yeah, not what you expected, but amazing nevertheless.
Hey, It's pretty late today, but why don't we play with it tomorrow? Sure. I'll be here in the morning and then we can play with it.
With that, I went home. The next day, I was there before lunch, and we went into the basement and laid out the board. Henry's basement was like a storeroom, but a bit cleaner. We often played there when it was raining or snowing outside. There was some furniture there, an old couch, a wooden cupboard that probably belonged to the previous owner, some more miscellaneous furniture, and a full-length mirror. We sat in the basement in front of the mirror and started playing. Before that day, we had never seen a real Ouija board, let alone played with one. All we knew was you are supposed to put your finger on the glass piece and ask questions. So we began. Is there a spirit here with us? I asked. And there was no reply. The glass piece did not move. We would like to connect with any spirit lingering in this house.
Oh, God.
I tried again. But again, there was no reply. Then we tried asking some more questions along the line, but still, no response.
I don't think there are any spirits here,
Henry said, finally frustrated. I think Ouija boards are fake. We both laughed after that.
Should we go upstairs for lunch? Nah, let's give it a last try, and if this time nothing happened, we will go up,
Henry said. Okay, if you say so. Is there any spirit or ghost who would like to talk to us? I said in a bored voice. I knew for sure there would be no reply. But suddenly, the glass piece moved and stopped at the word, yes.
Did you move it? No, I swear I did not.
When we both realized that the glass piece had moved on its own, we exchanged a scared but excited look.
Should immediately said goodbye.
Who are you?
Henry asked. The glass piece moved around some more and stopped on random letters. When we spelled them out, it gave us a name. Ivan Volkov. It seems like a foreign name, maybe Russian, I said.
Are you Russian?
Henry asked. The piece again stopped on yes.
Say goodbye.
Are you trapped here? Again, a yes.
Why are you trapped here?
This time, the piece moved for a long time. I died here, so I'm stuck here.
Oh, wow.
After every reply we got, we became more and more curious and carefree. The spirit Ivan, whom we had found to be a Russian soldier who had died here, seemed not so harmful. We gathered from our chat that he died in the late 1800s and was buried somewhere in an unmarked grave on Henry's property. He had been here ever since then. Suddenly, Henry's mom called us from upstairs for lunch. We got up and left just like that,
Y'all
too
didn't
eager
say
to have
goodbye?
lunch as we were pretty hungry. We ate our lunch while watching cartoons and then returned to the basement.
Now your house is haunted.
However, when we got down there,
His house.
nothing was how we had left it except the Ouija board. Everything was falling, and some of the old glass pieces were shattered on the floor. I and Henry were confused. The board and the glass piece were completely still untouched. However, when we looked into the mirror, we saw the reflection of the glass piece move, and a dead soldier was standing right behind us. We both screamed and
Say
ran upstairs.
goodbye.
Henry's parents were confused at first, but when we told them what had happened, his dad went downstairs and grabbed the godforsaken game. He put it into the tin box we had found it in, locked it, and the next day buried it somewhere deep into the forest. He believed that the Ouija board was cursed. That's why it was locked and buried in the first place. Also, upon doing some research, we realized that I and Henry just left the game for lunch without saying goodbye or ending our connection with the spirit.
So he was just up
After
in your
that
house
day,
playing.
I never played with a Ouija board in my life and steered clear of any such cursed games. Urban legends and myths have always been something my friends and I used to have a lot of fun with while growing up. We would occasionally scare or prank each other, but apart from this childish interest, we never really took any steps to find out if these myths were real or not. That was until our last week in high school when we decided it was time to take the next step. My friend Jason and I had watched a couple of YouTube videos where people played games summoning myths and
I'll let
demons.
it be though.
From Charlie Charlie to Bloody Mary, the idea of encountering a supernatural being or spirit intrigued us, and left us asking if these myths were truly myths or actual reality. A question that would eventually leave us all wishing we never asked. It was our last week of high school, and while most people our age were out partying and planning, I decided what my friends and I needed to do together before leaving for college was something we'd always wanted to do. My parents were out of town that week, so I figured there was no better time. I got on my computer and looked up some of the most popular urban myths to summon, but most instructions were either unclear or too complicated to carry out in my home. Eventually, I found a site that had listed numerous urban legends, stories, and instructions on how to summon, although warning against it. I spent a while on the site till I eventually found a game I had never heard of. One Man Hide and Seek. The next day I told my friends about the plan. Sophie was skeptical at first, but Jason and I helped her relax, and I told them to come over later that day so I could explain the rules and what I would need from each of them. Okay guys, this is called One Man Hide and Seek, and the rules of the game are simple. I continued. First, we need a doll that doesn't look human but has limbs. So Sophie, I think one of your rag dolls as a kid should work. Next, we cut the doll open with a needle, removing its stuffing and filling it with rice. I was interrupted by Jason saying, "Sorry, did you say rice?" I replied, "Yes, the rice attracts the demon." Then we clip our nails and put them in with the rice. We aren't supposed to put the nails of other people or else they might get hurt. After that, we take a piece of red thread and sew the doll back up without cutting off the extra length. Instead, we take the extra length and tie it around the doll before tying the two ends together. The site said this represents the doll's blood vessels and traps the spirit in the doll. I was interrupted again by Sophie and Jason laughing, but I couldn't understand why they found it a bit funny, so I continued reading the instructions. We filled the bathtub with water and put the doll in there to separate the spirit world from the real world. Then we found a room with a TV to hide in, so I was thinking the living room. We purify the room we're hiding in. Jason, your mom still has those incense candles she uses for yoga, right? Jason simply nodded and I continued. We'll place a cup of salt water and the needle in the room. Then we give the doll a name. Not ours and not anyone we know. Jason raised his hand before saying, "Lucia." Sophie and I didn't seem to have any issues with the name, so I continued giving instructions. It was getting a bit late now, so I decided to hurry up. After that, we turn off all the lights and devices apart from the TV. Then we say to the doll 3 times, "We are the first it." Then we run to the room, turn on the TV, and stay as quiet as possible. Sophie then said, "Hold on, why does the TV have to be on and what happens if we aren't quiet enough?"
Y'all gonna get hurt.
"Are you scared?" he said, laughing. I responded with, The room went silent for a while, but I continued. We close our eyes and count to 10. Once we're done, we get the needle, go back to the bathtub, and say to the doll, "We have found you, Lucia." Then we cut the thread, binding the doll, and say 3 times, "Lucia, you are the next it." Return the doll to the tub and hide in the room. We remain as silent as possible, fill our mouths with salt water, and search for Lucia. Most times, it remains in the bathroom, so no need to worry.
Most times would have had me like,
when
no,
we find
okay,
the doll, we spray the salt water from our mouths on its face and say, "We have found you." Then we burn the doll and discard its remains. I looked up to see a worried look on Sophie's face, and she eventually said, "So what happens if it's not in the bathroom and we can't find it?" I didn't have an answer to that, so I responded with, "The site doesn't say anything about that, but that's why we have to keep the salt water on us as protection. That's it." The concern on their faces became more obvious, and a part of me began to think, maybe it wasn't such a good idea. But I brushed the feeling off, and they simply went home agreeing to be back at mine by midnight. Sophie returned around 11 p.m., as she said. She didn't want to be out on the streets by midnight, while Jason, on the other hand, didn't arrive until 1 in the morning. I wasn't sure we had enough time to set up, as the game had to be played at exactly 3 a.m. But immediately, Jason arrived, we had it all set up in around 30 minutes. The ragdoll Sophie had gotten was green, and was also missing one of its button eyes. But we didn't think that would be a problem, as the doll didn't look human at all, and that was all that mattered. Eventually, it was almost 3 a.m., and it seemed Jason had gotten over his paranoia, if he had any, as no one was more excited than him to play the game. At around 2:58 a.m., we turned the lights off, turned on the TV, and before we knew it, it was time. We all walked into the bathroom, and the sight of a floating rag doll in a bathtub filled with water wasn't as creepy as I thought it would be. Jason walked up to Lucia, picked her up, and said, "Jason, Sophie, and Mark are the first it. Jason, Sophie, and Mark are the first it. Jason, Sophie, and Mark are the first it." He returned the doll to the tub, and we all moved back to the living room. Nothing out of the ordinary was happening, so we closed our eyes and began counting. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Before I could say 10, I heard a thud, followed by a light scream. So I immediately opened my eyes to see Jason holding on to Sophie and laughing. We stayed laughing for a while before eventually deciding to finish the game. I returned to the bathroom to see the doll still floating in the tub. At this point, I was feeling more comfortable now, so I picked up the doll and cut the thread with the needle before saying, "We have found you. You are the next it, Lucia." It was only as I said those words I realized something strange. Despite being submerged in water for a while now, the doll in my hand was nowhere near wet.
Like, you noticed
In
that
fact,
after you said
it
the demon
almost
shit?
felt completely dry. I returned the doll to the tub, and we immediately went back to the living room and filled our mouths with salt water. After waiting for a while, once again, nothing strange happened, and I could see relief on Sophie's face. At this point, I decided it was time to finally end the game, but as we began walking towards the bathroom, Jason spat the water from his mouth and said, "This was fun, guys, but it was obviously all a load of crap." I opened the door once again, expecting to see the funny sight of a rag doll floating in my tub for the third time that night. But all I felt that instant were chills run down my spine. Literally. The bathroom was eerily cold, and I could almost hear my heartbeat as I was met by the sight of the bathtub filled with nothing but completely still water.
Look at y'all playing with
"What the hell?" Jason said. But before he could say more, we heard a loud sound come from the living room. We slowly walked back into the living room to see the TV randomly changing channels from one to another before eventually losing audio and then switching off, plunging the room into darkness. I immediately rushed to turn on the lights. A look of fear was all over Sophie and Jason's face, and I couldn't help but wonder if I had made a terrible mistake making them play the game.
And you did.
Guys, let's just calm down. Find the doll and spray the salt water on its face. As long as we stay together, we should be fine. Sophie responded with, "Why can't we just leave and go home?" I could tell she was completely bothered now, so I replied calmly,
you heard the rules of the
site
game.
warned us against leaving
You do that,
because
you
our
gonna
nails
die.
are in the doll. It won't just let us go on with our lives, so relax. Come
His
on,
fault.
let's
Who the fuck is
just
gonna
find
put
the
nails?
doll.
Why would you put your
We
nails
looked around the
in
house for about
the
an
damn
hour,
doll?
all the while hearing loud thuds and sounds that didn't seem normal to anyone. The phones had lost all signal, and leaving the house wasn't an option. The longer we took, the more things we began to hear, and eventually, we could hear what seemed like laughter coming from all around the house. It was a deep laugh, and we couldn't tell exactly which direction it was coming from. That was until the voice finally spoke.
"Mark, Sophie, Jason, if what you seek is to return me to my realm, then come find me upstairs. But I warn you, I will not return alone. A soul must come back with me."
The voice was strangely deep, and the house felt extremely cold now. "What does that mean?" Sophie said. Jason
It means when
responded
y'all gonna
with,
die.
You know what it means.
They looked at me as if asking what next to do, but I was completely scared now, and I could tell they were too. "Let's go find it. Here," I said, handing them the glass of salt water. "No matter what, don't let the salt water out of your mouths, and let's stay together." Immediately, we walked upstairs. We could feel the temperature drop, and more laughter filled the house. Only this time, It was obviously coming from my parents' room. Jason began walking towards the room while we followed behind, and as we arrived at the door, everything went completely silent. Jason slowly pushed the door open, but before we could walk in, he was pulled in, and the door slammed behind him. I immediately began banging on the door, but it was as if someone was holding it firmly in place. I kept kicking and kicking till eventually it broke, and I walked into the horrific sight of Lucia seated on Jason. His hands appeared to be pinned to the floor, and although Lucia's hands weren't even close to Jason, huge claw-like marks were all over his chest. I stood frozen, looking at the horrific scene of my best friend Jason being mutilated by a doll. The doll abruptly paused and looked at me for a second. I could almost see a smile on its face, but before I could react, it was immediately covered in salt water from Sophie's mouth. Later that night, I burnt the doll and discarded its remains. The phone started working not long after the doll was burnt, and Sophie quickly called an ambulance. Jason survived the encounter, and no matter how many times we tried to explain the situation, there was no way the police were going to be convinced what we were saying was actually the truth. The police tried for months to make sense of the case, as the marks on Jason didn't seem human at all, and his story correlated with ours, but eventually they closed the case, stating we had been under the influence and Jason was probably attacked by an animal that night. A conclusion I could only wish was true. After that night, our curiosity for urban myths and legends completely faded, and sadly, so did our friendship.
I wouldn't be friends with you.
I am a father now, and I still spend hours wondering why the demon left Jason alive. The sleepless nights are less now, but I'll never forgive myself for putting their lives in danger, all in the name of an urban myth.
It was your fault.
Despite my experience, I wouldn't tell you all urban myths have some truth behind them, but I know for a fact that you should never play the game. One man, hide and seek.
We won't. We don't understand why you played it. That's crazy. Like, girl, stab that in the ass. We might have to watch that one, y'all. Like, why would you even do that? So, I did let it play through, even though we've seen that one before. It was in the Urban Legend one. So, I enjoyed the video. I enjoyed them all. 1 and 2 was hitting. Number 3 is still hitting, even though we've seen it before. But, like, why would you play a Ouija board that you found locked in something? Just, like, stop playing. Let me know how you felt in the comments, please. And until next time, you guys, I love you.